I'm Leo Warder for Kit Guru. Alphacool NexXoS Cool Alpha 240 DDC XT, what a name, is, as it says, a complete water cooling set. The name actually tells you something about it. So Cool Answer 240mm radiator, DDC is the type of pump, XT is because it's a 45mm thick radiator. And if you know anything about Alphacool, you also know copper. So copper radiator and copper cold plate on the CPU block. This Be Quiet case here, which is the Dark-Base 900 I recently reviewed for Kit Guru and liked, is my guinea pig here. So what I've done is I've rejigged it since my review. The graphics card is a Sapphire R9 Fury X, which has its own liquid cooling pack. I've replaced one of the 140mm fans that comes with the Be Quiet, the one at the rear. So the radiator that you can see is the graphics radiator. Obviously it's quite unusual to get a graphics card that has its own liquid cooling. In this instance I want to take it out of the equation so the heat goes out the rear rather than going around inside the case. And the all-in-one on the CPU, which is the motherboard is a Gigabyte X99 UD4, loads of Corsair memory, Core i7 5820K, and I've changed to a 240mm Corsair. I used a 360 fractal design in the original review. So I want to compare kind of the 240 Corsair with the 240 Alphacool. It's not a straight head-to-head challenge, that's not the idea. The idea is the Corsair H100i V2 is an absolutely classic 240mm all-in-one. It's 106, 108 pounds in the UK. By comparison, the Alphacool kit is 190 odd pounds, which for custom loop is pretty darn cheap, but obviously it's significantly more than the Corsair. So the idea is I'm going to pull out the Corsair, bung in the Alphacool, which is a classic custom loop in that you have a reservoir, pump, CPU block, bunch of hose, coolant go around, all look nice. The slight tweak is that it's a bay reservoir you get with Alphacool rather than a cylindrical reservoir, and the DDC pump plugs in the rear of the bay reservoir, so it's kind of a combined unit rather than it being a separate standalone pump. Other than that, you might ask yourself why you'd even be interested in a custom loop setup. Obviously the idea is looking for greater performance. There is also the fact you can expand it. Were you, for example, to get a GTX 980 like this and add a water block, you could easily plumb it into the same loop. Clearly the Fury X slightly changes that because it is already liquid cooled, but pretty much every other graphics card in the market is air cooled, either blower or circulating air around your case. Anyway, I'm not trying to persuade you about the merits of a custom loop particularly. I want to see what this thing does. It's a complete kit, includes everything, including the jumper that you use to bleed the system, power your power supply so it thinks it's connected to the PC so the pump can run. The one thing you don't get is a tube cutter. You can use a pair of scissors or a Stanley knife or something, but you don't get a great cut. Those cost me £6, so it's a trivial investment. It's just not the sort of thing you like to have lying around the house. It gives you a nice straight cut across the tube. Anyway, I'll pull out the Corsair and get plumbing with the Alphacool and see how we get on. Installing the Alphacool kit in this Be Quiet case is not particularly difficult, partly because the Be Quiet has so much space inside it, but also because the kit is, as liquid cooling kits go, very simple. So you've got to put the CPU block in place, which on this LJ 2011 is as easy as you can be. 4 studs, on goes the block, 4 thumb nuts, job done. Obviously remember the thermal compound. The sub-assembly of the bay reservoir and the pump, it takes a bit of a push and a fiddle. Then you've got some little nuts and screws that go to join those two together. You either have to use a pair of pliers to hold the nuts or have a very, very tiny spanner. So that's not absolutely ideal, but not the end of the world. That's probably the most fiddly part of the operation. Then you put the rad in place, connect up your hoses, pretty much job done. Some specific points about this kit rather than about custom loops in general. So it's a bay res, thus, and the filler is top center. Now in the Be Quiet you don't have access to the top center because you've got the front panel controls. Some cases you do, you could literally go in from above, fill it. In the case of the Be Quiet and many cases that have an IO gizmo or some such here, you're then obliged to pull the bay res out to put the coolant in. That means you need to give yourself a bit of slack on this hose here, which is why, to my mind, the hose setup doesn't look especially pretty. Now, you have to give yourself call it 50mm of free play. It'd be nice to have a bit more actually, and that really does start to look untidy. That is the downside of the Bay-Res setup. On the other hand, installing the Bay reservoir is quite easy. You don't require a separate mount as you do for a cylindrical reservoir. So in that respect, Alphacool's done a good job, but it's not ideal. On the other hand, Alphacool in the past had a Bay-Res where you had a kind of pop-out fillet that came out of the front, you put a funnel in it, but it was really finicky. Once the setup was together, bleeding it wasn't massively tricky. You have to kind of do a bit of rock and roll. Always remember, of course, air rises, so as the pump goes out of the back, that means essentially you want to lift up the back of the case so air can shoot out, and there's this gurgling rush, the liquid drops, liquid level in the Bay-Res drops, it pumps around, hurrah. If you're using a coloured dye in your coolant, as I am here, it obviously helps. You can really see the difference between bubbles and liquid. If you're using the clear, it's not quite so apparent. That's obviously standard practice. Once you've bled the thing, and once the air was moving around, and it bled pretty quickly, it was as noisy as heck. And here's the reason why. The Lang pump, which is a good one, operates a little over 3,000 RPM, 3,300 rings bell. It runs off a Molex 12 volt, and you've got a single connector, which I've plugged in down there to the Sys3 fan, which is one wire purely for monitoring the speeds. You go in the BIOS and it tells you what speed it's running at, but you cannot control it. The speed is fixed constant, unless you're going to do some sort of voltage control. But it's running off 12 volt, it runs over 3,000 RPM. When the coolant level drops to a certain extent, can I see the level on the front? Yes, you can see the front. I've got it up about 75%. Once it starts rushing around, the level pretty quickly dropped before I topped it up a few times. When the level was down below, certainly 50%, but actually 75% was borderline, it was as noisy as heck because the coolant is flowing around and it's basically a waterfall when it returns to the res. When you top it up to 75%, the coolant's returning inside the level of the coolant rather than above it and then splashing down. On the other hand, that does give you quite a handy audible indicator when your level is dropping. If it sounds as noisy as heck, your levels drop. Get in there, top it up. So swings and roundabouts there. The eagle-eyed amongst you will note that I've actually flipped the Sapphire Rad upside down on the Fury X graphics card. I did that purely to give you a clearer look at the Alphacool hoses. Wasn't necessary, it just made life easier. But the hoses would have kind of gone around each other. I noted actually that doing that seems to have affected the temperature of the graphics card negatively. It is better to have the Rad the other way up. But as I say, I didn't have to change it. I just did it to give you a better look at what's going on. One thing I did feel obliged to do was to mount the fans on the outside of the chassis in pull. Obviously, I've just left the top cover off so you can see what's going on. Now, Alphacool in their manual, which is a good manual, has lots of pictures. It's obviously multilingual, but it works well. It's clear. Each of the setups shows the fans in pull. Personally, I prefer to have the fans inside the Rad in push, but that's my choice. That, of course, means I then have to put the fans here, which, depending on the case, the motherboard and so on and so forth, could be a problem on space, but I like to have the option. The thing is, Alphacool supplied 8 30mm screws, 8 35mm screws, which is for this setup here. These happen to be the shorter screws, that's by the by, because the sheet steel is very thin. If you've got a chunky case, you might require a longer. If you're mounting the fans in push, then you'd want to use the longer screws on the to mount the fans to the Rad on the inside, and then you need a set of short screws to mount the Rad to the case. You don't get those shorter screws with the Alphacool setup, so actually the business about having it in pull, they're pretty much making it mandatory. Now, that works well and it's perfectly quiet, but again, depending on your case setup, that might not suit you. You might not like it visually, you might have some other reason for doing it. It also means that, and this is where it gets to be a bit finicky, the fans on the outside of the Be Quiet chassis, depending on the precise location of them in slotted mounts, you can move them around. You do get an element in certain positions of the fan rotor rubbing on the chassis, certainly at startup at any rate. When it's on the inside mounted to the radiator, provided you have clearance, you don't get that. So I'm not mad keen that it would only require 8 very cheap screws to give you the option either push or pull. As things stand, you have to do it the Alphacool way. And I'm not necessarily mad keen on that. One other thing is that the hose is quite a small diameter. It's a 13 mil OD, 10 mil ID. Flows plenty of coolant. It works absolutely fine. It does mean, on the other hand, that you have to be quite careful with the radius of your curves, because if you go for too tight a radius, it simply kinks, and that's obviously disastrous. With thicker hoses, they have more sort of rigidity, which can make it more awkward to route them. But on the other hand, it means they have some more inherent strength. So my preference would be for a 16 mil OD. The 13 OD works absolutely fine. Just something to note. Performance overall. Now, it so happens we've had a bit of a heat wave here in the UK. So when I tested with the Corsair H100i V2, which worked perfectly well, I'm going to ignore absolute temperatures here, just stick with deltas because of the difference in temperatures. The CPU, my Core i7 5820K, the delta, it went up by 13 degrees Celsius on 100% load. With the Alphacool, 9 degrees. So 13 degrees with the Corsair, 9 degrees with the Alphacool, so therefore it's better. That's lovely. The GPU, as it happens, got hotter in this setup. As I say, I'm sure it's because I flipped the rad over. So from the point of view of performance, the Alphacool performs slightly better than the Corsair, and I'm also quite sure it has more headroom if I start overclocking. This tells me almost nothing. The idea that a £110, I think it was, £108 Corsair all-in-one works pretty darn well, and the £190, my mistake, looking at the euro price, the £190 Alphacool setup works slightly better. Well, you'd expect that. So we'll park that. That's stating the obvious. Clearly, the Alphacool is easier to expand were I to want to add some other fancy-pantsy components or put in a different reservoir. Unlikely. More likely if on a liquid-cooled GPU. This, in that instance, the Fury X is the worst-case scenario because you ain't going to liquid-cool a liquid-cooled GPU. So it gives you the option of expanding. Now, this is where I have to sort of compare the Alphacool with something, and I think the EKWB Predator 240 is the obvious candidate here, because that is a kind of combo all-in-one stroke custom loop. It arrives, you plug it in, you don't actually have to assemble it. EK's done a clever job there. EK's used a different setup because the reservoir and pump are mounted on the radiator itself, so it's much more integrated, very neat. And it also highlights the different approaches that different companies use. So EK's gone, well, how do we make life easy to install? And they've basically put everything around the radiator. Alphacool's gone for the, well, bay reservoir, let's mount the pump to that, which means you don't have to then put bracketry in, and that works well enough. It is, of course, a fundamental problem if you have a case that doesn't have an optical drive bay, and I've seen plenty of cases in recent times that do not. So clearly those people will be not interested in this setup. I'm not thrilled by the lack of pump control, but once the system was bled, the pump, despite the fact it's hammering away at quite a speed, it's perfectly quiet, and that's lovely. You are relying on the bias. The Gigabyte bias here gives you all sorts of smart fan options and works very nicely, but you are pretty much monitoring what goes on. The fans here I've hooked into the Be Quiet fan hub on the back of the motherboard tray, so they're controlled, but the pump is roaring away. That's either going to work for you or not. That's pretty much it. Overall, the Alphacool, I'm impressed by it. I find it hard to love it, but it does a very good job. It looks fair enough. I mean, it looks fine. I'm not mad keen on having to build in some slack to that hose there, going from the bay res to the radiator. So the radiator, get my words out, because I have to be able to slide it forward. In a different case where I had access to the top of bay res, that wouldn't be an issue. The quality of the hardware is absolutely top notch. The fittings and the radiator in particular are class A. The pump is very good, but that's obviously a bought-in component, and the bay res is very nice. Pushing the pump into the bay res, nut and bolting it together, it kind of bows a bit on a sort of bit of a steel mounting plate side. That was the bit I liked least, but it works. So not a perfect setup, but pretty darn good in terms of pricing. Very hard to complain. 220 euros, about 190 pounds in the UK. Exchange rates here at the minute are fluctuating like billio. Performance good, noise levels low, options for expanding good. Not perfect, but impressive. I'm Leo Woodard for Kit Guru, and this is the Alphacool NexXoS Cool Answer 240 XT liquid cooling setup.